What's up, guys? Earth First Base Layer here. Recently I did a video named Fake History Needs to Stop, and this is going to be Fake History Needs to Stop Part 2. And I may just keep making a few of these as I come across new information. One of the things that is becoming very clear is that lots of new information is out there to be disclosed, and the history that we've been presented with is highly toxic, corrupt, and not accurate. This information here is absolutely, in my opinion, bombshell. One of the terms that we hear lately going around is cancel culture, and just the eliminating of certain parts of history that or the world that people just want to see it destroyed. And so what I found here, and I'll put links in the description for this gentleman's website, a gentleman named Michael Hoffman, and he's got a website called revisionisthistory.org. And I found some very interesting information here, an excerpt that he wrote from a book that he's got showing cancel culture in the 18th and 19th century. This is a sensitive subject, and it's nothing that I'm mad or upset about. I just want to make this disclaimer. This kind of information needs to be used in love, for people to come together and demand truth, because that's the only way that we can undo all the division in the world. And it's a lot of stuff to go through. But this guys, this is about slavery. So okay, whites in servitude in early America and industrial Britain. Okay, so what I've got here, it's about 12 pages long, which isn't really long. I planned on just highlighting some of the what I thought were going to be the highlights. Pretty much, I'm just going to read this whole thing. So if you want to get a cup of coffee, come back. It's not going to be a real long video, but some of this, all this information is so pertinent. This is actually turning upside down our entire what we thought, how this country was, built, founded, and executed when we were first starting the United States and the colonies and expanding westward. So I'm just going to get right into it, and most of it's I'm just reading, so just listen. And a few times I've made some notes where I've come across some terms that I thought needed to be defined. Maybe I didn't know what they were, or I wanted to expand on them, but mostly I'm just reading from the manuscript. All right, here we go. Whites in servitude in early America and industrial Britain. In 1997, Prime Minister Paul Keating of Australia refused to show proper respect to Britain's Queen Elizabeth II during her state visit. In response, Terry Dix, a conservative member of the British Parliament, said, "It's a country of ex-convicts, so we should not be surprised by the rudeness of their Prime Minister. A slur such as this would be considered unthinkable if it were uttered against any other class of or race of people except the descendants of white slavery." Dick's remark is not only offensive, it's ignorant and false. Most of Australia's convicts were shipped into servitude for such crimes as stealing 7 yards of lace, cutting trees on an aristocrat's estate, or poaching sheep to feed a starving family. The arrogant disregard for the Holocaust visited upon the poor and working class whites of Britain by the aristocracy continues in our time, because the history of that epoch has been almost completely extirpated from our collective memory. So I went to look up the word extirpated, E-X-T-I-R-P-A-T-E-D, because I wasn't sure the exact meaning of that. Merriam-Webster says, number 1A, to destroy completely, and 1B, to pull up by the root, and number 2, to cut out by surgery. So this word extirpated means this shows intent to hide, which means therefore deceive. And the etymology of the word deceive, the Latin origin, is desipere. I don't know if I'm saying that exactly right, but it means to catch, ensnare, or cheat. So Again, it's premeditated and on purpose. That what he's saying is this information was left out on purpose and destroyed. When white servitude is acknowledged as having existed in America, it is almost always termed as temporary indentured servitude or a part of the convict trade, which after the Revolution of 1776 centered on Australia instead of America. The convicts transported to America under the 1723 Waltham Act perhaps numbered 100,000. The indentured servants, who served a tidy little period of 4 to 7 years, polishing the master's silver in China and then taking their place in the colonial high society, were a minuscule fraction of the great unsung hundreds of thousands of white slaves who were worked to death in this country from the early 17th century forward. What? Up to one half of all the arrivals in the American colonies were white slaves, and they were America's first slaves. These whites were slaves for life. This slavery was even hereditary. White children born into white slaves were enslaved too. Whites were auctioned on the block, with children sold and separated from their parents and wives sold and separated from their husbands. White slaves were worked to death in the sugar mills of Barbados and Jamaica and the plantations of Virginia. The establishment has created this misnomer of the indentured servitude to explain away and minimize the fact of white slavery. But bound whites in early America called themselves slaves. 9/10 of the white slavery in America was conducted without indentures of any kind, but according to the so-called custom of the country, as it was known, which was lifetime slavery administered by white slave merchants themselves. In George Sandys' Laws for Virginia, whites were enslaved forever. The service of whites bound to Berkeley's Hundred was deemed perpetual. Berkeley's Hundred was I looked it up, it's a colony in Virginia. It was about 8,000 acres on the north side of the bank of the James River, on the north bank of the James River. It later became known as the Berkeley Plantation. So these accounts, I challenge any researcher to study 17th century colonial America, sifting the documents and the jargon and the statutes on both sides of the Atlantic, and one will discover that white slavery was an extensive operation. It is when we come to the 18th century that one begins to encounter more servitude on the basis of a contract of indenture. But even in that period, there was kidnapping of Anglo-Saxons into slavery as well as convict slavery. In 1855, Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who designed New York Central Park, was in Alabama on a pleasure trip and saw bales of cotton being thrown from a considerable height into a cargo ship's hold. The men tossing the bales somewhat recklessly into the hole were black. The men in the hold were Irish. Olmsted inquired about this to the ship worker, saying, "Oh," said the worker, "the Negroes are worth too much to be risked here. If the paddies are knocked overboard or get their backs broke, nobody loses anything." And if you don't know what paddies mean, it's a slur for Irish people. It's a racial, derogatory term for Irish people, used by a racist. Next section. Enslavement of white people, the documentary facts. While British slavers were traveling to Africa's western coast to buy black slaves from African chieftains, they also sold their own white working class kindred, which they called the surplus poor, as they were termed by Elizabethan and Stuart dynasty officials, from the streets and towns of England and Scotland into slavery. Hundreds of thousands of these white slaves were kidnapped children. In fact, the very origin of the word kidnapped is kidnapped, or the abduction of white children for enslavement. According to the English Dictionary of the Underworld, under a heading kidnapper is the following definition. Quote, a stealer of human beings, especially of children, originally for exportations to the plantations in North America, end quote. The center of the trade in child slaves was in the port cities of Britain and Scotland. Press gangs, in the hire of local merchants, roamed the streets, seizing by force such boys as seemed proper subjects for the slave trade. Children were driven in flocks through the town and confined for shipment in barns. So flagrant was the practice that people in the countryside about Aberdeen avoided bringing children into the city for fear they might be stolen. And so widespread was the collusion of merchants, shippers, suppliers, and even magistrates that the man who exposed it was forced to recant and run out of town. White slaves transported to the colonies suffered a staggering loss of life in the 17th and 18th century. During the voyage to America, it was customary to keep the white slaves below deck for the entire 9 to 12-week journey. And I'll interrupt right there. That's exactly what I remember seeing, but only, with only black people in old movies and newspapers and everything like that. But you see them all under the deck, all chained up, and this is exactly what they're about to describe. A white slave would be confined to a hole not more than 16 feet long, chained with 50 other men to a board with padlocked collars around their necks. The weeks of confinement below deck in the ship's stifling hold often resulted in outbreaks of disease which would sweep through the cargo of white freight chained in the bowels of the ship. So now they're just calling freight. Ships carrying white slaves to America also lost half their slaves to death. According to historian Sharon V. Salinger, scattered data reveal that the mortality for white servants at certain times equaled that for black slaves in the Middle Passage, and during other periods actually exceeded the death rate for blacks. Salinger reports a death rate of 10 to 20% over the entire 18th century for black slaves on board ships en route to America, compared with a death rate of 25% for white slaves en route to America. Foster R. Dole's writing in Labor in America, A History, states that whether convicts, children spirited from the countryside, or political prisoners, white slaves experienced discomforts and sufferings on their voyage across the Atlantic that paralleled the cruel hardships undergone by Negro slaves on the notorious Middle Passage. Doles says the whites were indiscriminately herded aboard the White Guineamen, another racial slur, often as many as 300 passengers on little vessels of not more than 200 tons burden, overcrowded, unsanitary. The mortality rate was sometimes as high as 50%, and young children seldom survived the horrors of a voyage which might last anywhere from 7 to 12 weeks. Independent investigator A.B. Ellis in the Argosy writes concerning the transportation of white slaves, the human cargo, so we've already heard them called freight, now cargo, many of whom were still tormented by unhealed wounds, could not all lie down at once without lying on each other. They were never suffered to go on deck. The hatchway was constantly watched by sentinels armed with hangers and blunderbusses. In the dungeons below, all was darkness, stench, lamentation, disease, and death. Marcus Jernigan describes the greed of the shipmasters, which led to horrendous loss of life for white slaves transported to America. Quote, The voyage over often repeated the horrors of the famous Middle Passage of slavery fame. An average cargo was 300, again, not people, cargo, but the shipmaster, for greater profit, would sometimes crowd as many as 600 into a small vessel. The mortality under such circumstances was tremendous, sometimes more than half. Middleberger, an eyewitness, says he saw 32 children thrown into the ocean during one voyage. The mercantile firms, as importers of white servants, were not too careful about their treatment, as the more important purpose of the transaction was to get ships over to South Carolina, which could carry local produce back to Europe. Consequently, the Irish, as well as others, suffered greatly. It was almost as if the British merchants had redirected their vessels from the African coast to the Irish coast, and the white servants coming over in much the same fashion as the African slaves. A study of the Middle Passage of white slaves was included in a parliamentary petition of 1659. It reported that white slaves were locked below deck for 2 weeks while the slave ship was still in port. Once underway, they were all the way locked up under decks amongst horses. They were chained from their legs to their necks. Those academics who insist that slavery is an exclusively black racial condition forget or deliberately omit the fact that the word slave originally was a reference to whites of Eastern European origin, the Slavs. This is good news for black people whose enemies have attempted to brand them as a hereditary slave race. That is not so. The word for whites of Eastern Europe is synonymous with the word slave, talking about Slavs again. Moreover, in the 18th century in Britain and America, the Industrial Revolution spawned the factory system whose first laborers were miserably oppressed white children as young as 6 years of age. They were locked in the factories for 16 hours a day and mangled by the primitive machinery. Hands and arms were regularly ripped to pieces. Little girls often had their hair caught in the machinery and were scalped from their foreheads to the back of their necks. I can't even imagine seeing that. White children, and any child, I don't care the color. Just the conditions are terrible. White children wounded and crippled in the factories were turned out without compensation of any kind and left to die of their injuries. Children late to work or who fell asleep were beaten with iron bars. Lest we imagine these horrors were limited to only the early years of the Industrial Revolution, 8 and 10-year-old white children throughout America were hard at work in miserable factories and mines as late as 1920. Now, for those of you who don't know, which wouldn't be many people, but we remember the Civil War was in the 1860s under Abraham Lincoln. And if there's still young children working, these child slaves in 1920. So, moving on, Americans are taught that black slaves, Mexican peons, and Chinese coolies built this country, while the vast majority of the whites lorded it over them with a lash in one hand and a mint julep in the other. The documentary record tells a very different story, however. When white Congressman David Wilmot authored the Wilmot Proviso to keep black slaves out of the American West, he did so, he said, to preserve that vast expanse of territory for the sons of toil, my own race and color. This is precisely what most white people in America were, sons of toil, performing back-breaking labor such as few of us today can envision. They had no paternalistic welfare system. These whites were the expendable frontline soldiers in the expansion of the American frontier. They won the country, felled the trees, and cleared and planted the land. The wealthy, educated, white elite in America are the sick heirs of what Charles Dickens in Bleak House termed telescopic philanthropy. The concern telescopic philanthropy, the concern for the condition of distant peoples, while the plight of kindred in one's own backyard are ignored. I'll read that one more time. The concern for the condition of distant peoples, while the plight or kindred in one's own backyard are ignored. Today, much of what we see on television and at the movies are films depicting blacks in chains. Blacks being whipped, blacks oppressed. These are facts, and the oppression of black people in America should not be denied. Telling the truth about white enslavement does not detract from the horrors of black enslavement. By the same token, neither should the history of white enslavement be denied or minimized. Fairness and fidelity to the documentary record impel us to state that nowhere can we find a cinematic chronicle of the whites who were beaten and killed in white slavery. 4/5 of the white slaves sent to Britain's sugar colonies in the West Indies did not survive their first year. Soldiers in the American Revolution and sailors impressed into the American Navy received upwards of 200 whiplashes for minor infractions. But no TV show lifts the shirt of these white yeomen, I don't know if I'm saying that right, yeoman, to reveal the scars on their backs. I did look up that word, whether I'm saying it correctly, I didn't write that down, the pronunciation, but these are farmers. These were white farmers. They were called self farmers. They physically worked alongside the slaves that they owned. They weren't part of the elite, and so even they would get tortured and beat sometimes. I'm going to skip forward here, just a page or two, to continue. Okay, by the early 1800s, men of property and station in the English Parliament had outlawed black slavery through the empire. While this Parliament was in session to enact this law, my throat is getting dry. While the Parliament was in session to enact this law, ragged 5-year-old white orphan boys, beaten, starved, and whipped, were being forced up the chimneys of the English Parliament to clean them. Sometimes the chimney masonry collapsed on those boys. Other times they suffocated to death inside their narrow smoke channels. Legions of white children also labored underground in British mines, while naked or nearly so, and in great misery. Long after blacks were free throughout the British Empire, the British House of Lords refused to abolish the mining and the chimney sweeping by English children under the age of 10. The Lords contended that to do so would interfere with property rights. Don't you love it? The lives of the white children were not worth a farthing and were considered no subject for humanitarian concern. The Chronicle of White Slavery in America comprises the dustiest shelf and the darkest corner of suppressed American history. For example, there was strong resistance to the Confederacy in the poverty-stricken areas of the mountain South, such as Winston County in Alabama and the Beach Mountains of North Carolina. Those poor whites could not imagine why any white laborer would want to die for the slave-owning plutocracy that more often than not scorned poor white laborers as trash. To this day, the white ruling class denigrates the white poor. On July 12th of 2018, high-ranking FBI official Peter Strzok, a liberal Democrat, testified in Congress. There he was confronted with his statements about working-class whites. He said they stink or smell and in general are ignorant hillbillies. For centuries, elite whites have despised, brutalized, and oppressed poor whites. And starting to wrap this up, he writes, there will only be racial peace when the knowledge of radical historical truths are widespread and both sides negotiate from positions of strength, not from fantasies of white working class guilt. That's totally true. And that doesn't just go for racial peace, but all types of peace. It's not going to be until we get the truth as it is, not misdescribed, misconstrued, or with some kind of deception woven into it to keep us divided, that we will be able to have this peace in all areas. The Bible declares that the man who does not take care of his own family is worse than an infidel. This also applies to one's kinsmen. The man who neglects his own children to care for yours has true love for neither. I agree with that last sentence. Many white liberals who claim to care for the civil rights of black and third world people discard the working class of their own people on the garbage heap of history. When they are finished with their own, they shall surely turn on others. And I think we're seeing, a lot of this type of behavior now, with all the massive brainwashing that we've got going on with our media and everything else. So, I encourage you guys to go visit the website. There's a lot of really eye-opening stuff there. What's amazing about this information is, we grew up in school. Of course, we know that just about everything they taught us in grade school has turned out to be incorrect, misdescribed. You can put it in nice words, or you can put it in a bunch of four-letter words, whatever floats your boat. But, a lot of it's bullshit. So, not only are they faking the globe and space and whatever, the subject of the shape of the world, they're faking our history. So this is part of the deception that we have to share with each other, because if this is true, and I encourage everybody to go read for themselves and talk about it, and let's get this stuff out there, because if this is true, then the whole narrative of black slaves in this country is a lie, and that's shameful, because it has they tried to create a race war for a couple hundred years with this stuff, leaving white people out of it, and I don't want any kind of, there's no guilt trips, there's no reparations. Oh, now I get to play the victim. No, none of that. Like I said, it has to be done out of love and just recognition that we've all been lied to, and we've got to just forgive and move forward in love, and we'll just be done with these false masters, right? So, yeah, they're faking. Not only have they faked the shape of the world and everything else, we know the media is fake, but they literally just throughout our history, they just faked it. And it's really hard to question it once you get so many decades and hundreds of years down the road when it's so ingrained. But this right here, this information, I believe is super powerful, because they have to keep us divided. If that's the ultimate enslavement, is the division and the creation of fear that generates. So if you can fake history and burn history books or the ones that you don't like, to write his story or his story, that's the ultimate enslavement. So, that's magnitudes more than slavery, the blacks and the whites, being bought and sold for slavery, for physical labor back when this country started, and in Britain. I mean, there's been slaves of all different colors and creeds and races since the beginning of time. I mean, there's slavery in the Bible. It's always been, but we've been lied to about it, especially the beginning of the history of this country. So, how long have they been faking this stuff? I would say forever. How long have they been using revelation of the method as to spread lies, for us to think that they're revealing disclosure and revealing truth, but they're actually just letting us continue to warp the truth and spin webs of deception, and we think that we're telling the truth. We think that we're uncovering the truth. That's the level that these guys play at. That's how they play their chess game, right? They get us to do their dirty work for them by bearing false witness to each other all the time. So that's one of the big problems. And so I'm not telling you to believe this because I read it to you, but go look at it, talk about it. That's what we have to do. Because in the end, they're using all of these tricks, these revelation of method tricks and angles to get us to stay divided and stay in fear. And that really that's the ultimate false master, the ultimate enslavement. It's the enslavement of here, here, and here. And that's what they want. So, again, Michael Hoffman wrote this. His website is www.revisionisthistory.org. I encourage everybody to go down there. Thank you guys for watching, listening, participating. Hit the like, subscribe, share it with people, and go print this document off yourself. It changes everything that we thought we knew about this type of behavior in the beginning of our country. So, thanks, guys. Earth first. Peace.